The cameras arrived on a Thursday afternoon in unmarked brown boxes that the delivery driver stacked on my porch without knowing he was handing me the evidence that would save my life. My son Kevin had been dropping hints for 3 months about my failing memory, about how I'd forgotten his birthday, I hadn't, and how I'd called him by his father's name twice, also untrue. But the morning I overheard him on the phone in my kitchen saying, "Monday we commit her, Tuesday we list the house." I knew this wasn't concern. This was calculation. I was 71 years old, owned my home outright in a neighborhood where houses sold for $500,000, and apparently my only child had decided I was worth more to him incapacitated than independent. The cameras were small, Wi-Fi enabled, and according to the reviews, invisible when mounted correctly. I had 48 hours before Kevin's alleged timeline began, and I was about to document every single word that came out of his mouth. If you've ever had family turn on you for money, subscribe and tell me what state you're in, because what I captured over the next 47 days would shock even the most cynical among you. Installing the cameras took me 6 hours because my hands shook with rage and fear in equal measure, and I had to watch the setup video 3 times to understand how to angle them for optimal audio pickup. I placed one in the living room behind a framed photo of Kevin's college graduation, the irony not lost on me that his smiling face would witness his betrayal. Another went in the kitchen above the refrigerator, disguised behind a decorative tin I'd bought at a craft fair. The third camera I mounted in the dining room, inside a fake plant Kevin's wife Michelle had given me for Christmas, which I'd always suspected was a regift anyway. Each camera connected to an app on my phone that I password protected with a combination Kevin would never guess, the date his father died, which he'd forgotten twice already. The recordings uploaded automatically to a cloud account I'd opened using my maiden name, creating a digital trail that existed completely outside Kevin's awareness or control. By Sunday night, every camera was operational, their tiny red recording lights hidden by strategic positioning, and I went to bed knowing that whatever happened next would be documented with timestamp precision that no amount of gaslighting could dispute. Monday morning arrived with Kevin at my door at 8:45 a.m., earlier than he'd visited in months, carrying coffee from the expensive place downtown that he knew I loved. "Morning, Mom," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. And I took the coffee while mentally noting that the kitchen camera was recording every word, every gesture, every tell that he thought I was too senile to catch. Michelle trailed behind him, her designer purse probably worth more than my monthly Social Security check, and they settled at my kitchen table like they owned it, which, I supposed, they thought they soon would. "We need to talk about your living situation," Kevin started, and I let him speak while sipping coffee that suddenly tasted bitter despite its caramel flavoring. He used words like concerning and safety and your best interests, painting a picture of a woman who couldn't manage her own life, who needed intervention, who should be grateful her son cared enough to take control. Michelle nodded along, adding comments about quality memory care facilities they'd toured, places with wonderful activities and trained staff. Not one of them mentioned that these facilities cost $8,000 monthly, or asked if I wanted to liquidate my home to pay for imprisonment I didn't need. The conversation lasted 37 minutes, and I played my role perfectly. Confused, a little forgetful, agreeing that yes, perhaps I had been struggling. Maybe they were right that I needed help. Kevin's relief was visible when I didn't fight him, when I asked soft questions about timelines and logistics instead of demanding to know why he'd discussed selling my house before I was even moved out. "We're thinking this week," he said, glancing at Michelle, who nodded encouragement. "There's a lovely place in Riverside that has an immediate opening. We could get you settled by Friday and then start preparing the house for sale. The market's really hot right now, Mom. We don't want to miss the window." The way he said, "we," made my stomach turn. There was no we in this decision, just him and his wife dividing assets that belonged to me while I was still breathing. But I smiled and said I'd think about it, that maybe they were right, that perhaps it was time. Kevin stood to leave looking satisfied, probably already calculating his inheritance, and I walked them to the door playing the grateful, addled mother. The camera captured everything, including Michelle's whispered comment as they reached the porch. "God, that was easier than we thought. She's really going downhill." Tuesday brought my sister Eleanor, who I'd called the previous night after Kevin left, filling her in on everything from the overheard phone call to the installed cameras to yesterday's kitchen ambush. Eleanor was 73, sharp as ever, and had never particularly liked Kevin even when he was a child. "That calculating little snake," she'd hissed over the phone. "Your father would have disowned him." Now she sat in my living room drinking tea while I showed her the camera app, playing back yesterday's conversation with the volume low enough that we could hear every damning word. "We need a lawyer," Eleanor said, her jaw tight with anger that matched my own. "Not just any lawyer, someone who specializes in elder law, who's seen this kind of financial exploitation before. I know someone from my bridge club whose daughter handles these cases. Let me make a call." She pulled out her phone, and within an hour I had an appointment scheduled for Thursday with attorney Sarah Chen, whose practice focused exclusively on protecting seniors from exactly the kind of predatory behavior my son was attempting. Eleanor stayed for lunch, and we spent the afternoon reviewing the recordings, taking notes on times and quotes, building a timeline of Kevin's manipulation. The camera in the living room caught us working. Two elderly women mounting a defense that would blindside the man who'd underestimated us both. Wednesday, Kevin returned with Michelle and a man he introduced as Dr. Raymond Foster, a psychiatrist who specialized in geriatric cognitive assessments. "Mom, Dr. Foster has agreed to do a quick evaluation just to establish a baseline for the facility," Kevin explained, and I understood immediately that this wasn't about my health. This was about documentation, about creating a paper trail that would justify whatever legal action he was planning. Dr. Foster was probably 60, professionally pleasant, asking me questions about the date, the president, simple math problems, and requests to remember word lists. I answered everything correctly because there was nothing wrong with my mind, but I watched Kevin's face fall slightly with each right answer. Saw him exchange glances with Michelle that the cameras would capture beautifully. "She seems quite sharp today," Dr. Foster told Kevin after 20 minutes, and I could see my son struggling to reconcile his narrative of my decline with the evidence sitting in front of him. "She has good days and bad days," Michelle interjected quickly. "You should see her when she's confused. Last week, she didn't recognize Kevin for almost 10 minutes. A complete lie, and one that the doctor noted skeptically in his tablet. The appointment ended with Dr. Foster telling Kevin he'd send his report within 48 hours, and I had a feeling that report wouldn't support the commitment case Kevin was trying to build. Thursday's meeting with attorney Sarah Chen changed everything from desperate defense to strategic offense, transforming my position from victim to prosecutor in ways I hadn't dared hope possible. Sarah's office was downtown, on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled like old wood and expensive coffee, and she greeted Eleanor and me with a firm handshake and sharp eyes that had probably seen every variation of family betrayal. "Tell me everything," she said, and I did, from the overheard phone call to the cameras to Kevin's attempts to manufacture incompetence. Sarah listened without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad, and when I finished, she leaned back in her chair with an expression that I recognized as controlled fury. "What your son is attempting is called undue influence and financial exploitation of an elderly person. In this state, it's a felony that carries penalties up to 5 years in prison and mandatory restitution. The fact that he's trying to have you involuntarily committed as a means to access your assets makes it significantly worse." She pulled up something on her computer, typing rapidly. "The recordings you have are admissible in court as long as you're a party to the conversation, which in your own home, you are. The fact that you've documented 47 days of attempts at manipulation, coercion, and coordination to deprive you of your liberty and property, this is prosecutable, and more importantly, it's defensible." She looked at me with something like respect. "Mrs. Morrison, you've built an airtight case. Now we need to decide how you want to proceed." The options Sarah laid out ranged from civil action to criminal prosecution, from restraining orders to complete disinheritance, and Eleanor and I spent 2 hours in that office weighing justice against family, consequences against mercy. "He's my son," I kept saying, even though the words felt hollow when matched against what he'd been planning. "He's your son, who was going to have you involuntarily committed to steal your house," Sarah replied. Not unkindly, but firmly. He's your son who brought a psychiatrist to your home to manufacture evidence of incompetence. He's your son who is, right now, probably coordinating with facilities and realtors to dispose of your life like you're already dead. At some point, Mrs. Morrison, love has to make room for consequences. Eleanor squeezed my hand, and I made my decision. I want to file for a protective order, preventing him from making any medical or financial decisions on my behalf. I want the recording submitted as evidence of his intent, and I want him to know, in a courtroom, that I was fully aware of everything he tried to do. Sarah nodded, already pulling forms from her filing cabinet. Then that's what we'll do. But I'm recommending we go one step further. Let's schedule a competency hearing. Let's get you in front of a judge with a court-appointed psychiatrist. Let's create an official record that you are of sound mind, and let's do it before Kevin files whatever paperwork he's planning to file. Offense is better than defense in cases like this. I signed forms for the next 40 minutes, each signature feeling like reclaiming pieces of myself that Kevin had tried to steal. Friday brought a call from Kevin that the cameras caught because I'd started answering every call on speakerphone, creating yet more documented evidence of his manipulation. "Mom, we've scheduled your move for Monday," he said, his voice carrying false cheer that made my skin crawl. "The facility in Riverside has your room ready, and Michelle's hired movers to start packing your things on Sunday. We thought we'd make it easy for you, handle all the logistics so you don't have to stress." The presumption was staggering. He'd arranged to dismantle my life without my explicit consent, working off my vague "I'll think about it" from Monday's conversation as if it had been binding agreement. "What about the house?" I asked, playing confused and compliant. "Well, we'll need to list it fairly quickly," Kevin replied, and I could hear the eagerness he was trying to mask. "Michelle's already talked to her realtor friend, and the market's at a peak right now. We're thinking we could list it for $520,000, maybe get multiple offers if we stage it right." He was counting my money before I was even gone, planning his windfall with my assets while I listened to every mercenary word. "That seems fast," I said softly. "Don't you think we should wait? Make sure I'm really settled before making such big decisions?" Kevin's sigh was audible, impatient. "Mom, we've been over this. The longer we wait, the more the market could shift. And honestly, keeping the house empty while you're in care is just asking for problems. Trust me on this, okay? This is what's best for everyone." By everyone, he meant himself. Saturday, I spent documenting everything in a detailed timeline that Sarah had requested, matching recordings to dates and times, transcribing the most damaging quotes word for word. Eleanor came over to help, and we worked at my dining room table surrounded by printed transcripts and highlighted notes, building a narrative that was damning in its completeness. "Listen to this one from Wednesday," Eleanor said, playing a recording where Kevin and Michelle were in my kitchen while I was supposedly napping upstairs. "Did she sign the papers yet?" Michelle asked. "Not yet, but I'm working on it," Kevin replied. "Once we get her moved Monday, I'll bring the power of attorney documents to the facility, tell her it's just standard paperwork. She's foggy enough after moves that she probably won't read it carefully. If she does, I'll just tell her it's temporary, for emergencies only." Michelle's laugh was sharp. "And once you have POA, we can list the house immediately. I'm so ready to be done with this. The place needs a total renovation before we could even live in it ourselves." The casual cruelty of that conversation, the way they discussed my home and my autonomy like I was already gone, made me want to scream. But instead, I transcribed it carefully, added it to the timeline with timestamps, and paperclipped it to the section labeled "Evidence of Conspiracy to Commit Fraud." The file was now 3 inches thick, and Sarah had everything she needed for court on Tuesday. Sunday morning, Kevin and Michelle arrived with a moving truck and 3 hired workers, all before 10 a.m., and I answered the door in my bathrobe, looking appropriately confused and overwhelmed by the chaos. "Mom, remember we talked about this? The movers are here to start packing for your move tomorrow," Kevin said, already gesturing the workers inside like he owned the place. But I noticed he didn't have a key, had to wait for me to open the door, which meant he hadn't progressed to outright breaking and entering yet. Small mercies. "I don't remember agreeing to today," I said, which was true and also strategic. Establish confusion on my terms, not his. "We discussed it Friday, Mom. You said it was fine." Another lie documented on recording. I'd said no such thing. But I let them in. Let them start wrapping dishes and boxing books. Let Kevin think his plan was proceeding smoothly, while cameras recorded every moment of this unauthorized invasion. Michelle directed the movers with the confidence of someone who'd already decided what was valuable and what was garbage, earmarking furniture for donation that had been in my family for 3 generations. "This old china cabinet is worth maybe $100, she told one of the movers, gesturing at a piece my grandmother had brought from Ireland. "We'll send it to auction. No room for it in the new place." The new place being the memory care facility, where I'd have a single room barely large enough for a bed and dresser. Eleanor showed up around noon with lunch and concern that was entirely performed for Kevin's benefit, playing the worried older sister while documenting everything on her phone's camera, creating redundant records in case Kevin somehow discovered and destroyed mine. Monday was move day, except I wasn't moving, and Kevin was about to discover that the mother he'd underestimated had been 3 steps ahead the entire time. He arrived at 8 a.m. with Michelle and a manila folder I assumed contained whatever fraudulent documents he intended to trick me into signing, and his face when he walked in and saw me dressed professionally, makeup applied, sitting at my dining room table with attorney Sarah Chen and her paralegal, was worth every moment of fear and anger I'd experienced in the past 47 days. "What's going on?" Kevin asked, his confident stride faltering. "Mom, what is this? You're supposed to be ready to go." Sarah stood, extending her hand in professional greeting that Kevin took reflexively. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Sarah Chen, your mother's attorney. We need to discuss some concerns that have arisen regarding your attempts to have Mrs. Morrison involuntarily committed and to gain unauthorized access to her assets." The color drained from Kevin's face, and Michelle's mouth actually fell open. "I don't know what she's told you, but my mother is not well," Kevin started, recovering quickly into the concerned son routine. "We're trying to help her, to make sure she's safe and cared for. If she said anything about us trying to take advantage..." Sarah cut him off with a raised hand and a stack of papers that she slid across the table. "Mr. Morrison, what your mother has is 47 days of recorded conversations documenting your intent to have her committed against her will for the purpose of financial gain, your coordination with your wife to sell her property without consent, and your attempts to manufacture evidence of incompetence. We have you on tape discussing timelines for commitment and property sales. We have you on tape planning to trick her into signing power of attorney documents. We have you on tape disparaging her mental capacity to medical professionals." Sarah's voice was steel, wrapped in professional courtesy. "What we have, Mr. Morrison, is enough evidence to pursue criminal charges for attempted elderly exploitation, fraud, and conspiracy. So no, this move is not happening, and you need to leave these premises immediately." The silence that followed Sarah's statement was profound, broken only by Michelle's sharp intake of breath and the sound of Kevin's folder hitting the table as his hands went slack. "You recorded us?" he finally managed, his voice cracking on the last word. "In your own home?" I spoke for the first time, my voice steady despite the hammering of my heart. "I recorded conversations in my home, which is perfectly legal and increasingly necessary when your own son is plotting to have you institutionalized for profit. Every word you said, Kevin, every plan you made with Michelle, every lie you told doctors and movers, and probably half the neighborhood about my supposed cognitive decline. All of it documented, time-stamped, and backed up in multiple secure locations." I pulled out my phone, opened the app, and showed him the grid of camera feeds from around the house. "See that one? That's from last Sunday when Michelle told the movers my grandmother's china cabinet was worth $100 so you could pocket the difference when you sold it for $800 at auction. See this one? That's from Wednesday when you told Dr. Foster I couldn't recognize you, which the video clearly disproves. And this one..." I clicked to a saved favorite. "This is from your very first conversation on my porch, when Michelle said I was really going downhill. Turns out I wasn't going anywhere except to court, and you're coming with me." Kevin looked at Michelle, who looked at the door like she was calculating escape routes, and I saw the moment they both realized that the trap they'd been building around me had snapped shut on them instead. Michelle recovered first, her voice taking on a tone of wounded indignation that probably worked in other contexts but fell flat here. "We were trying to help you. You've been acting so strange, forgetting things, and we thought..." Sarah interrupted again, her patience clearly finished. Mrs. Morrison, if you speak again, I'll have you listed as a co-defendant in any legal action Mrs. Morrison decides to pursue. My advice to you right now is to remain silent and consider contacting your own attorney." Michelle's mouth snapped shut, and Kevin slumped into a chair he hadn't been invited to occupy, his face a mix of shock and calculation as he processed the complete destruction of his plans. "What do you want?" he asked, looking at me with something I couldn't quite identify. Fear, maybe, or the beginning of comprehension about consequences he'd never considered. "I want my house," I said simply. "I want my autonomy. I want the title to my property clear of any claims or liens. I want you to sign an affidavit stating you have no current or future interest in my medical decisions or estate. And I want you to understand that what you tried to do to me wasn't love or concern or help. It was betrayal for money, and it's something I'll never forget, even if I might eventually forgive." Sarah placed a document in front of Kevin, something her paralegal had prepared in advance. "This is a voluntary relinquishment of any claims to Mrs. Morrison's property, assets, or medical authority. You can sign it now, or we can pursue this through criminal court, where you'll likely sign something similar as part of a plea arrangement after spending considerable time and money on your defense. Your choice." Kevin's hand shook as he picked up the pen, and I watched him sign away any legal claim to my life with 3 different signatures on pages that Sarah's paralegal witnessed and notarized on the spot. Michelle signed too, her expression one of barely suppressed rage that she couldn't afford to release, with a lawyer documenting every word. "There's a restraining order being filed today that will prevent either of you from coming within 500 feet of Mrs. Morrison or this property," Sarah continued, gathering the signed documents into her folder. "Violation of that order will result in immediate arrest and prosecution. Mrs. Morrison is also updating her will to specifically exclude you from any inheritance, Kevin, with detailed explanation of your attempted exploitation, so that no future court will be able to challenge her testamentary capacity or intent. Additionally, we're filing notice with every memory care facility and hospital in a 60-mile radius that you are not authorized to make any decisions on her behalf, and that any attempt to commit her should be reported to law enforcement immediately." She stood, indicating that this meeting was over. "You have 10 minutes to remove yourself from this property. The security cameras that caught everything you said over the past 47 days are still recording. I suggest you leave without further conversation." Kevin and Michelle stood mechanically, and I watched them walk to the door of my home for what I suspected would be the last time. Kevin turned at the threshold, opening his mouth like he wanted to say something. An apology, maybe? Or a justification? Or one more attempt at manipulation? But Sarah's pointed look stopped him, and he left without another word. The door closed behind them, and I heard their car start, engine noise fading as they drove away from the house they'd been so certain would be theirs. The competency hearing took place on Wednesday in a courtroom that smelled like furniture polish and old paper, with a judge who'd seen enough family exploitation cases to be skeptical of adult children claiming suddenly that their parents couldn't manage their own affairs. Sarah had arranged for a court-appointed psychiatrist to evaluate me the previous day, and that doctor, Dr. Patricia Williams, about 50 and refreshingly direct, had spent 90 minutes with me, asking the same questions Kevin's hired psychiatrist had asked, plus dozens more about my life, my independence, my understanding of my assets and responsibilities. "Mrs. Morrison, there is absolutely nothing wrong with your cognitive function," Dr. Williams had told me at the end of our session. "Your memory is good, your reasoning is sound, your executive function is intact. Whatever your son has been claiming about your decline is not supported by any clinical evidence that I can find." Her report, submitted to the judge that morning, said exactly that in medical terminology that left no room for interpretation. Now I sat at a table with Sarah while the judge reviewed the documents, and across the courtroom Kevin sat with his own lawyer, someone he'd apparently hired yesterday in a panic, looking like a man watching his life unravel. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Judge Patricia Hernandez, spent 20 minutes reading through everything, and when she finally looked up, her expression was severe. "Mr. Morrison, I'm going to be very direct with you. What you attempted to do to your mother constitutes elderly abuse under state law, And frankly, you're lucky she's chosen civil remedies over criminal prosecution. She held up Dr. Williams's report. Your mother is completely competent. She has no cognitive impairment, no signs of dementia or diminished capacity. What she does have is 47 days of recorded evidence that you attempted to manufacture incompetence in order to gain control of her assets. Judge Hernandez looked at me then, with something like respect. Mrs. Morrison, your autonomy is fully protected by this court. The restraining order Ms. Chen filed is granted. Your son is legally barred from any involvement in your medical or financial affairs, and I'm ordering this decision be noted in all relevant databases to prevent future attempts at unauthorized guardianship. She banged her gavel once. Case closed. The aftermath of the hearing brought a strange calm to my life, like the silence that follows a storm when you emerge to assess what survived and what was destroyed beyond repair. Kevin attempted to call once, 2 days after the court decision, and I answered on speaker with Eleanor present as witness. "Mom, I'm sorry," he said, his voice carrying something that might have been genuine remorse, or might have been regret at getting caught. I no longer trusted myself to tell the difference. I know I handled things badly, but I really thought I was helping, really thought you were declining and needed intervention. The lie was smooth, practiced, the same kind of manipulation that had led us here. Kevin, I have 47 days of recordings that document your actual motivations, which had nothing to do with helping and everything to do with a $500,000 house you wanted to sell. Don't insult both of us by pretending otherwise. I kept my voice level, emotion drained away by weeks of anger and fear that had nowhere left to go. You need to understand that what you tried to do has permanently changed our relationship. You're not cut off, that's not who I am. But you're also not trusted. Not with my health, not with my finances, not with my future. Those bridges are burned, Kevin. You burned them when you decided I was worth more to you incapacitated than independent. Silence on his end, then a sound that might have been crying or might have been calculated performance. "I'm your son," he finally said. "You're going to cut me off completely? After everything?" The entitlement in that statement was staggering. You tried to have me committed against my will, Kevin. You tried to steal my house. You told doctors I was incompetent and moving companies to pack my belongings without my consent. You don't get to play the victim when I defend myself from that. I ended the call without waiting for his response, and Eleanor reached across the table to squeeze my hand in solidarity. The symbolic weight of the cameras evolved over the weeks that followed, transforming from instruments of evidence gathering into permanent installations that I no longer felt guilty about keeping active. The recordings had saved my autonomy, had given me proof when gaslighting tried to make me doubt my own perceptions, had provided the documentation necessary to stop Kevin's exploitation before it reached irreversible stages. But they also served a new purpose now, peace of mind. Every conversation that happened in my home was recorded, creating an audit trail that protected me not just from Kevin, but from anyone who might mistake my age for vulnerability. Sarah had helped me draft a document that I kept copies of in 3 locations, explaining the existence of the cameras, their purpose, and the fact that all recordings were backed up automatically to secure cloud storage with multiple access points. The document specified that in the event of my unexpected death or sudden decline, the recording should be immediately reviewed for any evidence of coercion, undue influence, or exploitation. It named Eleanor as primary executor of my estate, Sarah as legal counsel, and Dr. Williams as the medical professional authorized to assess my competency if questions arose. Kevin was explicitly excluded from any decision-making capacity, with detailed explanation of his previous attempts at manipulation attached as supporting documentation. The paper trail was now so comprehensive that any future attempt to challenge my autonomy would require overwhelming evidence to overcome the documented history of my sound judgment and clear intent. I'd turned myself into a fortress, protected not by walls, but by information, and the cameras were my sentries. Eleanor moved into my guest room on a semi-permanent basis, not because I needed care, but because we both enjoyed the company, and she'd been looking for an excuse to leave her condo anyway. We developed routines: morning coffee on the porch, afternoon walks around the neighborhood, evening television watched with commentary that ranged from thoughtful to ruthless, depending on what we were viewing. She'd been through her own family betrayals with her late husband's children, and we shared stories of exploitation and survival that created a bond deeper than simple sisterhood. "The cameras make me feel safer too," she admitted one night over tea. "Not from burglars or strangers, but from the kind of danger that wears familiar faces and claims to be helping while dismantling your independence piece by piece." Kevin taught us both that family can be the most dangerous threat. I'd updated my will the previous week, splitting my estate between Eleanor, several charities, and a trust fund for Kevin's children. My grandchildren, who I still loved despite their father's betrayal. Kevin himself received $1 and a letter explaining exactly why, with explicit reference to his attempted exploitation and the court documentation of his fraudulent intent. Sarah had assured me the letter made any will contest virtually impossible. No court would override clearly stated wishes backed by that level of documentation. My house remained mine, my decisions remained mine, and the cameras kept watch over a life that had been nearly stolen, but was now more firmly under my control than ever before. The financial reality of what Kevin had attempted began to crystallize as I reviewed my assets with Sarah and a financial planner she'd recommended, a woman named Joan Martinez, who specialized in protecting elderly clients from exploitation. My house was worth $540,000 in the current market, not the $520 Kevin had mentioned. Interesting how he'd undervalued it by $20,000, probably planning to pocket the difference. My savings totaled $138,000. My Social Security provided $1,900 monthly, and I had a small pension from my late husband that added another $700 per month. Total assets of roughly $680,000, enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life without ever selling my home. "If Kevin had succeeded in having you committed, he could have liquidated everything," Joan explained, showing me spreadsheets that quantified the theft Kevin had been planning. "The memory care facility would have cost about $8,000 monthly, plus medical bills, plus his administration fees if he'd gotten power of attorney. You'd have been depleted in maybe 5 years. At which point you'd have been transferred to a Medicaid facility while he kept whatever was left from selling your house. It's a common pattern in elderly exploitation. Adult children see their parents as obstacles to inheritance rather than people deserving autonomy." She showed me strategies for protecting my assets going forward. Putting the house in a trust, establishing automatic payments for bills so Kevin couldn't claim I was mismanaging finances, creating medical directives that explicitly named who could make decisions if I ever actually did become incapacitated. But right now, Mrs. Morrison, you're more competent than half the 40-year-olds I work with. You've protected yourself brilliantly. The validation was welcome, but it didn't erase the grief of having needed to protect myself from my own son. 3 months after the court hearing, I ran into Michelle at the grocery store in an encounter that the cameras couldn't document, but that Eleanor witnessed in full, standing next to me as I selected produce like we hadn't just come face to face with one of the people who'd tried to institutionalize me for profit. Michelle looked thinner, stressed, and she actually had the audacity to approach me. "How are you, Patricia?" she asked, using my first name with a familiarity she'd lost the right to when she'd planned to sell my grandmother's furniture. "I'm well, Michelle. Remarkably competent, according to the court-appointed psychiatrist." The barb landed, and I watched her flinch. "Look, I know things got out of hand. Kevin and I were just trying to help, and maybe we approached it wrong." Eleanor cut her off with a laugh, sharp enough to draw looks from other shoppers. "You approached trying to steal a house and commit a woman to memory care against her will. That's not wrong approach, Michelle. That's criminal conspiracy." Michelle's face hardened, dropping the apologetic mask. "You know what? You won. You got your house, your independence, your precious autonomy. Kevin's been devastated, by the way. His own mother turned against him, got lawyers involved, humiliated him in court. I hope you're happy." The entitlement was breathtaking. "Michelle, Kevin tried to have me involuntarily committed so he could sell my house. He brought a psychiatrist to my home to manufacture evidence of incompetence. He hired movers to pack my belongings without my consent. And your contribution was coordinating with realtors and planning which of my furniture to sell versus donate. So yes, I'm happy. I'm happy I caught you both. I'm happy I had the presence of mind to install cameras and document everything. And I'm happy that the law actually protected me from you. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm shopping for a dinner I'll make in my kitchen, in my house. That will never be yours. The epilogue of my story unfolded slowly over the following year, as life settled into a new normal defined less by what Kevin had tried to take and more by what I'd discovered I could protect and build without him. Eleanor and I traveled to Ireland to see the village where my grandmother's china cabinet had been made, and we took a photo of it in my dining room before we left, sending copies to the Historical Society there, who were fascinated by its survival story. We visited 3 other states, always returning to my house that remained mine, and Eleanor began talking about officially moving in permanently, selling her condo and splitting expenses. We're both getting older, but that doesn't mean we're getting helpless, she'd say. 2 sharp women are harder to exploit than one. She was right. The cameras recorded our daily lives now in a way that felt less like surveillance and more like protection, evidence that we were living fully, competently, independently, despite our ages. I'd started a blog at Eleanor's suggestion, writing about elderly exploitation and how to protect yourself, and the response had been overwhelming. Hundreds of comments from people sharing their own stories of adult children who treated them as obstacles to inheritance, of manipulation and gaslighting and financial abuse disguised as concern. I'd become accidentally an advocate, my experience a cautionary tale that apparently resonated with thousands of people who'd faced similar betrayals or feared they might. Sarah helped me navigate some of the legal questions readers asked, and Dr. Williams occasionally contributed posts about recognizing real cognitive decline versus manufactured incompetence. We'd built a community of survivors, and my house had become its symbol, the place that almost got stolen, but remained stubbornly, defiantly mine. Kevin called once more on my 72nd birthday, and I answered on speaker with Eleanor beside me and the cameras rolling, documenting what I suspected would be our last conversation. "Happy birthday, Mom," he said, voice carrying a weariness that might have been genuine exhaustion with conflict or might have been frustration that his plans had failed so completely. "Thank you, Kevin." I kept my voice neutral, offering neither warmth nor hostility. I wanted to say I'm sorry again, really sorry, for everything that happened. I've been in therapy, working through why I thought what I did was acceptable, and I'm starting to understand how badly I messed up. The apology was more specific than his previous attempts, acknowledging actual harm rather than just handling things badly, and I appreciated that increment of honesty even if I couldn't fully trust it. "I'm glad you're getting help, Kevin. I truly am. But I need you to understand that an apology doesn't undo what you tried to do. You wanted me committed. You planned to sell my house. You lied to doctors and movers and probably half your friends about my mental state. Those aren't actions you can erase with therapy and remorse." Silence stretched between us, and I waited to see if he'd argue, justify, or finally just accept accountability. "I know," he finally said. "I know I can't fix this, can't go back and make different choices. I just wanted you to know I see it now, see how wrong I was, and if there's ever a way to earn back even a fraction of your trust, I'll do it. Not for the house or the money, I get that's gone, and it should be. But just so you know, I'm still your son, and I do love you, even though I did a terrible job showing it." The words were right, better than anything he'd said before. But trust wasn't rebuilt in a single conversation after such comprehensive betrayal. "Thank you for calling, Kevin. I'll think about what you said." I ended the call without promises of reconciliation or forgiveness, without invitations to visit or suggestions of future contact, because some wounds needed time measured in years rather than months, and I wasn't sure I had enough years left to fully heal from what my only child had tried to do to me. The cameras remained active, their silent witness to a life lived with full awareness that vigilance was the price of autonomy, especially for elderly women who society too often dismissed as incompetent simply because they'd accumulated years. I'd become something of a local celebrity in my neighborhood after the story spread. Elderly woman outsmarts, son trying to steal her house through hidden camera evidence, and neighbors I'd barely spoken to for decades started stopping by with coffee and conversation, perhaps seeing me differently now as someone who'd fought and won rather than someone to be pitied or patronized. Mrs. Chen from across the street confessed that her own daughter had been pressuring her to sell and move to assisted living, and I'd helped her install similar cameras, teaching her the app and the backup systems, passing forward the protection I'd learned to build. My house had become a sort of informal headquarters for elderly resistance, a place where women could come and learn how to document their competence, protect their assets, and push back against adult children who'd started counting inheritance before their parents were gone. Eleanor and I hosted monthly gatherings now, bringing in Sarah to discuss legal protections and Joan to explain financial safeguards, and the living room where Kevin had once plotted my commitment was now filled with women in their 60s and 70s and 80s, learning that age didn't equal helplessness and that documentation was power. The symbolic resolution of the camera system occurred almost exactly 1 year after I'd first installed them, when I received notice that Kevin had filed for bankruptcy. His own financial mismanagement catching up with him now that my assets weren't available to bail him out. Michelle had filed for divorce 2 months prior, citing irreconcilable differences, but really, according to my sources, angry that the house she'd been counting on never materialized. Kevin had apparently taken out loans against his expectation of inheritance, and when that inheritance evaporated in courtroom documentation of his exploitation attempts, his creditors came calling. He'd lost his house, his wife, his financial stability, and his relationship with his mother, all because he'd been unable to wait for natural inheritance and had instead tried to force the timeline through fraud and manipulation. There was tragedy in it, certainly, watching your child destroy his life through greed and impatience, but there was also justice. The cameras had captured not just his crimes, but the consequences of those crimes, documenting the full arc from conspiracy to collapse. I'd kept every recording, organized them chronologically with detailed notes, and archived them in 3 separate locations as both evidence and warning. If Kevin ever tried to contest my will, if he ever tried to claim diminished capacity or undue influence from Eleanor, if he ever tried to rewrite history and pretend he'd been the victim of elder manipulation rather than its perpetrator, the cameras had 47 days of truth that would stop him. The footage was my insurance policy, my protection, my proof that I'd been sound of mind while he'd been criminal of intent, and that distinction was documented down to the timestamp. The inheritance I'd eventually leave would go to people who'd earned it through presence rather than predation, through love rather than calculation, through respecting my autonomy rather than trying to steal it. Eleanor would receive the house and half my financial assets, enough to live comfortably in the home we'd built together after Kevin's betrayal had paradoxically brought us closer. The other half would be split between charities focused on protecting elderly people from financial exploitation, organizations that could use my money to help others avoid what I'd barely escaped. Kevin's children, my grandchildren who I still loved despite their father's failures, would receive educational trusts that matured when they turned 25, old enough to hopefully have learned better values than their father had demonstrated. Kevin himself would receive $1 and the letter I'd written explaining exactly why, with instructions that the letter be read aloud if he contested the will, ensuring that his attempted exploitation became public record in probate court if he forced the issue. Sarah had crafted the will with provisions that would cost Kevin more in legal fees than he could possibly win even if he succeeded in overturning any portion, making contest financially impossible for someone already bankrupt. The cameras had given me the power to protect my legacy the same way they'd protected my life, ensuring that even after I was gone, Kevin couldn't rewrite history or claim I'd been incompetent or manipulated in my final dispositions. Every decision I'd made was documented, dated, witnessed, and backed by psychiatric evaluation, confirming my sound mind. My will was unassailable, and Kevin would have to live with that reality, just as I'd had to live with the reality of his betrayal. The financial investments I made with Joan's guidance transformed my assets from simple savings into strategic protections that would outlast my lifetime, creating structures that prevented exploitation even after death. The house went into a revocable living trust with Eleanor as trustee and successor beneficiary, removing it from probate and making it impossible for Kevin to contest or delay transfer. My bank accounts were restructured as payable on death directly to Eleanor and the designated charities, again bypassing probate and Kevin's potential interference. I'd established a medical directive that specified Eleanor and Dr. Williams as my healthcare decision-makers, with explicit language excluding Kevin from any medical authority and requiring any institution that granted him access to my medical information or decisions to pay liquidated damages of $50,000 to me or my estate. The document was legally aggressive, designed to make any attempt at end-of-life exploitation so costly that no hospital or facility would risk it. Joan had helped me understand that protecting elderly people required not just legal documents, but financial penalties that made exploitation economically irrational. "You're building a fortress made of paperwork and consequences," she'd told me, and she was right. Every document I signed, every trust I established, every directive I filed was another wall between my autonomy and those who might try to breach it. The cameras had taught me that documentation was power, and I'd applied that lesson to every aspect of my life that could potentially be contested or controlled after I was no longer able to defend myself. The blog I'd started had grown beyond anything I'd anticipated, with thousands of followers and regular features in elderly advocacy publications that treated my story as a case study in successful self-defense against financial exploitation. I'd been interviewed by 3 different news outlets, always carefully maintaining that I didn't hate my son, but that I'd had to protect myself from his actions, walking the line between warning others and publicly destroying Kevin's reputation more than I already had. The interviews felt important, though, because the response I got, the messages and emails and comments from people who'd experienced similar betrayals, proved that Kevin's behavior wasn't unique or even particularly unusual. Adult children stealing from elderly parents was apparently common enough to be epidemic, and most victims didn't have the resources or awareness to install cameras, hire lawyers, or fight back before their autonomy was stripped away. My story had become a template for others, a proof of concept that defense was possible if you acted early and documented thoroughly. Sarah had been interviewed too, discussing the legal strategies we'd employed and encouraging other elderly people to establish protections before crisis hit, rather than waiting until they were already under attack. The cameras had evolved from my personal protection into a public awareness tool, their story educating thousands of people about the reality of elder exploitation and the specific steps necessary to prevent it. I'd accidentally become an advocate by documenting my own survival, and the purpose that gave my life felt more valuable than any inheritance I could have left Kevin. The second anniversary of the day I'd installed the cameras arrived with a celebration that Eleanor organized, inviting Sarah and Joan and Dr. Williams and about 15 women from our monthly protection gatherings to my house for cake and conversation that ranged from legal strategy to family gossip to unrelated topics that reminded us we were people before we were victims or survivors or advocates. Mrs. Chen brought homemade dumplings, and Dr. Williams contributed a case of wine that she insisted was medicinal, given the stress we all managed daily. Sarah's paralegal came with her mother, who'd recently installed cameras in her own home after her son started asking concerning questions about her finances. The living room and kitchen were full of laughter and stories, women comparing notes on manipulative adult children and sharing victories over attempted exploitation. "To Patricia," Eleanor said at one point, raising her wine glass in a toast that everyone echoed. "Who taught us that being old doesn't mean being helpless? That family betrayal can be survived, and that the best defense is a good offense backed by 47 days of recorded evidence." Everyone laughed and cheered, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Community built on mutual protection and shared experience. Women who understood that the greatest danger often wore familiar faces and claimed to be helping. The cameras were still recording, documenting this celebration the same way they documented Kevin's conspiracy, proving that my life after his betrayal was fuller and richer than what he'd tried to reduce me to. I'd lost a son, but gained an army, and the trade felt almost worth it. The practical reality of aging continued despite the drama of legal battles and family betrayal, bringing its own challenges that I now faced with Eleanor's partnership and the security of knowing I had systems in place to protect my autonomy, even if my body or mind eventually declined. I was 73 now, Eleanor 75, and we both had the usual age-related issues, arthritis, blood pressure management, the occasional memory lapse that would have terrified me before, but now felt normal, because Dr. Williams had explained the difference between normal aging and dementia. Everyone forgets where they put their keys sometimes, she'd told me during my annual competency review that I'd voluntarily scheduled to maintain documentation of my sound mind. That's not Alzheimer's. That's being human. You're looking for patterns of decline, not individual incidents. The distinction was important because Kevin had weaponized normal forgetfulness into evidence of incompetence, and I refused to let fear of ordinary human fallibility make me vulnerable again. Eleanor and I had emergency plans now, medical alert systems, a network of neighbors who checked on us, regular doctor appointments where we asked questions and took notes and maintained the paper trail of proactive healthcare management. We'd become experts at documenting our own competence, not because we enjoyed the paranoia, but because we'd learned that proof of capability was the only defense against those who would exploit perceived weakness. The cameras remained our insurance policy, but they were supplemented now by medical records and financial statements and regular competency evaluations that created a comprehensive picture of two elderly women managing their lives with more awareness and documentation than most people half their age maintained. Kevin's grandchildren, my grandchildren, reached out through social media when they turned 18 and 20, curious about the grandmother they'd barely known because Kevin had kept them away after the court case. I'd expected anger or at least wariness, but what I got instead were questions about what had really happened, because apparently Kevin's explanations hadn't satisfied teenagers who'd learned to spot manipulation from growing up with him. My dad said you turned against him, that you got lawyers involved and ruined his life over nothing, my oldest grandchild Taylor told me during our first video call, Eleanor listening beside me and the conversation being recorded for my protection. But I found the court documents online, and they say he tried to have you committed to steal your house. That's not nothing. The blunt teenager honesty was refreshing after years of adult manipulation, and I'd taken 3 hours to explain everything. The overhead phone call, the cameras, the 47 days of documentation, the court hearing and its aftermath. Your father made choices that hurt me badly, I'd told Taylor. I had to protect myself, and that protection meant excluding him from my life and my finances. But you're not responsible for his choices, and I'd love to know you if you're interested in knowing me. We'd been video calling monthly since then, and both Taylor and younger sibling Jordan had visited twice, interested in the grandmother who'd fought back and the great-aunt Eleanor who'd helped. I'd shown them the camera system, explained the documentation and the legal protections, and watched them process the gap between the grandfather who'd tried to exploit vulnerability and the grandmother who'd refused to be vulnerable. This is kind of badass, Grandma, Jordan had said, looking at the organized archives of evidence, and I'd laughed because that wasn't how I thought of myself, but maybe it was accurate. I'd been badass enough to protect myself when my own son had become predator, and that was worth being proud of. The reflection on what I'd lost versus what I'd gained occupied my thoughts more as time passed and perspective accumulated, weighing the pain of Kevin's betrayal against the strength I'd discovered through surviving it. I'd lost the relationship I thought I had with my son, lost the comfortable fiction that family loyalty was unconditional, lost the naive trust that people who claimed to love me would protect rather than exploit my vulnerabilities. Those losses were real, and they hurt in ways that didn't fully heal even with time and distance and justice. But I'd gained Eleanor's full-time companionship, gained the respect of my community, gained skills in documentation and legal protection that I'd shared with dozens of other elderly people. I'd gained the certainty that I could defend myself, that age hadn't made me helpless, that I was capable of strategic thinking and decisive action when necessary. I'd gained freedom from fear of my own decline because I'd learned the difference between normal aging and exploitation-worthy incompetence. And perhaps most importantly, I'd gained the knowledge that my home would remain mine, that my autonomy was protected, that no one could institutionalize me against my will or steal my assets through manipulation now that I'd built fortress-grade defenses around my independence. The cameras had been the catalyst for all of it, transforming me from potential victim into documented survivor, and their ongoing presence was a reminder that vigilance wasn't paranoia when the threats were real, and the threats sometimes carried your last name. The legacy I would ultimately leave wouldn't be measured in dollars passed to Kevin. There would be none. But in the protection strategies I'd taught to others, the legal precedents Sarah had helped establish through my case, and the proof that elderly people could fight back successfully against exploitation if they had information and resources and the willingness to document their own competence. My story had been cited in 3 different court cases now, other elderly people using my camera strategy and similar evidence to defend against their own predatory adult children. And each time Sarah called to tell me about another victory using our playbook, I felt a satisfaction that inheritance could never provide. I'd turned my near victimization into a weapon that protected others, and that transformation felt like the best possible use of a painful experience. The blog would continue after I was gone. Eleanor would maintain it, and the educational content I'd created about protecting elderly autonomy would remain available for anyone who needed it. My house would become Eleanor's and eventually be sold or kept according to her needs, but its symbolic importance as the place that almost got stolen but remained mine would persist in the stories shared at our monthly gatherings. I'd become accidentally a symbol of resistance against elder exploitation, and while I'd never sought that role, I'd embraced it because the alternative was letting Kevin's betrayal be meaningless suffering rather than transformative purpose. The cameras continued their silent documentation, recording breakfast conversations and afternoon tea, evening television, and late-night talks with Eleanor. The mundane dailiness of life lived with full autonomy in a home that remained stubbornly, defiantly mine. Sometimes I reviewed old footage, watching Kevin's conspiracy unfold in real-time recordings that still had the power to shock me with their casual cruelty. Commit her Monday, sell the house Tuesday, captured in high-definition audio that made his intent undeniable. Michelle's dismissal of my grandmother's furniture, Dr. Foster's skeptical questions when Kevin's claims didn't match the competent woman in front of him, the moving company workers packing my belongings without my consent, all of it preserved in digital format that would outlast my memory of these events. The recordings were difficult to watch but important to maintain, because they were the proof that I hadn't overreacted, hadn't misunderstood, hadn't imagined or exaggerated the threat Kevin had posed. The cameras showed objective reality in situations where gaslighting tried to make me doubt my own perceptions, and that validation was valuable beyond any monetary measure. I'd copied the most important clips onto multiple drives that I kept in different locations. One at Sarah's office, one in my safe deposit box, one with Eleanor's personal documents, ensuring that even if someone destroyed my house and everything in it, the evidence of what Kevin had tried to do would survive. The cameras had given me power through information, and I'd learned to treat that information as carefully as I would any precious asset. The final accounting of what the cameras had cost versus what they'd saved was straightforward enough from a financial perspective. $300 for the equipment and setup versus $680,000 in assets Kevin had been planning to liquidate. The return on investment was extraordinary, even before factoring in the value of maintaining my independence, living in my own home, making my own decisions, and avoiding institutionalization in a memory care facility where I didn't belong. But the true cost wasn't measured in money. It was measured in family relationships destroyed, in the knowledge that my son had valued my house more than my autonomy, in the permanent wariness I now carried about trusting people who claimed to be acting in my best interests. Those costs were real and lasting, and some days I wondered if preventing Kevin's exploitation had been worth the loss of our relationship, if maybe I should have confronted him directly instead of installing cameras and building legal cases. But then, I'd remember the overhead phone call, the casual way he'd discussed committing me and selling my house like I was an inconvenience to be managed, rather than a person with rights and dignity. And I'd know that documentation had been necessary, because confrontation wouldn't have worked with someone already that deep into manipulation and entitlement. The cameras had saved me from a fate Kevin had planned without my consent, and the fact that saving myself meant losing him was tragic but unavoidable. He'd made his choices, and I'd made mine, and the cameras were the evidence that I'd chosen correctly. If you've stayed with me through this entire journey from that first overhead conversation to the year-after anniversary celebration, thank you for witnessing my story and understanding that elderly people facing exploitation from their own children need to know that defense is possible, that documentation is power, and that fighting back can succeed when approached strategically and legally. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about people who refused to be victims of family betrayal, who used intelligence and planning to protect themselves from those who should have protected them, who learned that age is not the same as helplessness and that autonomy is worth defending at any cost. Comment below with your city or state if you've faced similar situations or know someone who has, because this community we've built of survivors and defenders and witnesses is how we combat the isolation that exploitation depends on. My cameras are still recording, my house is still mine, my independence is still intact, and Kevin is still learning that some betrayals have permanent consequences. The lesson I'd teach anyone facing similar threats is simple. Document everything, trust your instincts when family behavior feels wrong, build your legal fortress before you need it, and remember that protecting yourself isn't betraying family. Allowing yourself to be exploited is betraying yourself. The cameras gave me the power to protect myself when my own son became the threat, and I'd install them again without hesitation if I could go back knowing what I know now. Because the only thing worse than discovering family betrayal is being helpless to stop it.